Even before the United States entered the Second World War, the US Navy was already seeking out an aircraft that could serve as a successor to the SBD Dauntless and act as a possible replacement for the SB-2C Helldiver, which was running into some major pre-operational development setbacks. Brewster, Curtiss, and Douglas all submitted proposals. Brewster's design was known as Project P-37, of which very little is known. Assuming the presented diagram is indeed that of the P-37, it is reasonable to assume that it had a shared lineage with the Naval Aircraft Factory SBN, another Brewster design. Curtiss proposed the XSB-3C. Essentially, this was just a larger and improved Helldiver with a tricycle landing gear configuration. This new aircraft was designed around the Wright R-3350, however the Pratt & Whitney R-4360 was also considered at a later date. Given Curtiss's troublesome history with the SB-2C, the Navy wasn't particularly keen on adopting a design which would likely have inherited many of the teething problems of the Helldiver, much of which remained unresolved. This, combined with a reliance on a higher octane fuel that was not readily available for carriers, meant that the SB-3C never saw the light of day and remained on the drawing board. This leads us to Douglas's design, the XSB2D. This two-seat aircraft was manned by a pilot and a rear gunner, who could operate two remotely controlled gun turrets. Much like the Curtiss design, the SB2D was also designed around the Wright R-3350. The Navy wanted to future-proof the design and required a handful of new design philosophies to be included. To improve high-speed performance, the wing was to be of a laminar flow design, and a tricycle landing gear configuration was used in place of a conventional layout. This would help improve the carrier handling and pilot visibility. This tricycle configuration was a bit of a novelty at the time, with even the Army Air Corps having limited experience with such designs. The Bell P-39 Airacobra was the first such design to enter service, and even the proposed navalized version, the Bell XFL, was converted into a taildragger configuration. The tricycle gear layout resulted in a different landing attitude which pilots were not yet experienced with. The use of a nose wheel meant that the main gear, and subsequently the wings upon which they were mounted, were forced to be further back. This was necessary to correct the weight distribution. This change did have the side effect of reducing the effectiveness of the rudder and elevators. This aerodynamic deficiency was later corrected by increasing the surface area of the rudder on the BTD-1. As for the laminar flow design wing, this feature promised many benefits, all of which was dependent on the uninterrupted airflow over the wing surfaces. Wing-mounted air brakes, which was pretty standard at the time, would interrupt that airflow, negating the benefits of such a wing design. The XSB2D was also a heavier aircraft than previous dive bombers, and thus needed a larger, more effective air brake. Many aircraft would use a hybrid flap system, allowing the flaps themselves to act as air brakes as well. In the case of the SB2D, the Navy required the use of slotted flaps, meaning that was out of the question. Eventually, the designers settled on a combination of wing and fuselage-mounted dive brakes. Relatively small, picket fence-type dive brakes were installed in the wings, while 4 larger panels were installed in the fuselage. These were installed on the exterior of the fuselage in an almost makeshift fashion, instead of being flush within the fuselage. This was in an attempt to expedite the dive tests. Due to the makeshift fashion upon which the air brakes were fastened, a large degree of buffeting was anticipated. The square appearance of the XSB2D was a result of the required bomb load and the need for optimized usable interior space. This internal bay could carry up to 2 1,000-pound general-purpose bombs or 2 1,600-pound armor-piercing bombs. Additional hardpoints were fitted to the wings, allowing for smaller bombs or depth charges to be equipped. When serving as a scout bomber, the XSB2D was designed to carry a 77.5-gallon auxiliary fuel tank on the right side of the internal payload bay, leaving the left-hand side free for a single bomb. Alternatively, it could also carry a 200-gallon auxiliary tank, filling out the entire payload bay. The XSB2D could also carry up to 2 torpedoes, although some modifications to the payload bay was required, primarily in the form of the removal of the payload bay doors. On screen, I have on display a table covering a variety of different payload options for the different roles the XSB2D was expected to fill. Although the data presented is accurate, given the experimental nature of the XSB2D, the configuration changed throughout its development, so this information should not be considered definitive. In addition to the internal payload, the XSB2D was also armed with 2 20mm cannons, one in each wing. In terms of defensive armament, the XSB2D was relatively well defended in comparison to other dive bombers of the era. As mentioned earlier, The aircraft was equipped with two remotely operated turrets, one in a dorsal and another in a ventral position. These were to be operated via a telescopic periscope sight. Each turret was fitted with a single 50 caliber Browning machine gun. The system allowed for a single gunner to effectively operate the two turrets while simultaneously reducing drag. The turrets were designed with a contour follower to interrupt the fire of the guns as they passed in front of parts of the aircraft, preventing the turret from accidentally shooting off its own tail. While technologically impressive, these turrets and the associated gunner would eventually be removed. Wartime experience dictated that a lighter, faster aircraft was more desirable than a heavy, slower, but well-defended aircraft. Even before its maiden flight, the XSB2D was shaping up to be a failure. Due to the strict production tolerances of the laminar flow wing, development was slow, and it took a full 17 months for the prototype to be ready to fly. By then, it was a full 2,500 pounds over the established specifications. Additionally, the aircraft was projected to be quite expensive. In April 1943, the XSB2D finally took its maiden flight, demonstrating a mediocre flight performance. At higher speeds, the aircraft handled just fine, however its slow speed handling characteristics were quite poor. This likely would have been a major problem when it came to the carrier certification, had the aircraft ever gotten that far into its acceptance testing. The handling characteristics, in combination with the complex system and overweight nature, ultimately led to the demise of the XSB2D, with the project officially being terminated in June 1944. This is not where the XSB2D story ends, as after the termination of the project, one of the two prototypes was delivered to NACA's Ames Research Laboratory, where it continued to fly between 1944 and 1946. It was here that the XSB2D served as the very first aircraft type to be tested in NACA's new 40-foot by 80-foot full-scale wind tunnel. Unfortunately, this airframe would be lost after an engine fire forced it to crash land in 1946. Neither crew member was seriously injured, but the aircraft was a complete loss. While the XSB2D itself had officially been terminated, Douglas was allowed to continue work on the BTD-1, a related development that dates back to 1942. As mentioned before, the defensive turrets and second crew member were deleted from this design, but it still inherited the same R-3350 engine, the tricycle landing gear, the 20mm offensive weaponry, and the large internal bomb bay. In place of the gunner's position, an additional 130-gallon fuel tank was installed as an auxiliary tank. The primary tanks were composed of two 130-gallon and two 110-gallon tanks, allowing for a total of 610 gallons of internal fuel capacity. Should it be required, additional fuel could be carried via two 100-gallon tanks or one 255-gallon tank fitted within the weapons bay at the cost of a reduced payload capacity. Early examples of the BTD sported only the small wing-mounted picket fence type dive brakes. Eventually, the fuselage-mounted panels, as seen on the XSB2D, were refined and equipped to all subsequent BTDs. Initially, these fuselage-mounted dive brakes were composed of 4 individual parts, one on each side and 2 underneath the belly. This was eventually refined into a 6-panel configuration with an increased surface area. On all production units of the BTD, the right R-3350 was mated to a 3-bladed Hamilton standard propeller with a diameter of 12 feet and 8 inches. At 2,800 RPM, the engine was rated to 2,000 horsepower, which was considerably low in comparison to the later models of the R-3350. The flight controls were conventional, being cable-operated. The flaps were electrically driven, while the dive brakes, landing gear, wheel brakes, and just about any other moving part was all controlled by the hydraulic system. For those of you who have watched my mixed propulsion series, you may already be familiar with the XBTD-2. This was the Navy's last-ditch effort to keep the destroyer relevant, even as Douglas was actively trying to get the project cancelled. The XBTD-2 saw the removal of the aft auxiliary fuel tank, and in its place was a Westinghouse 19B axial flow turbojet. This produced a weak 860 pounds of thrust. Obviously, the destroyer had never been designed around the installation of a jet engine. The obvious spot to place the air intake would have been along the wing roots, similar to the Ryan FR-1 Fireball. In the destroyer, however, that was where one of the fuel tanks was stored. This led Douglas to place the air intake in perhaps what may have been the least desirable location, fitted inconveniently in a dorsal position. A centrifugal flow engine likely could have coped with this fairly well. However, the limited space meant that the aforementioned axial flow engine was the only option. To maintain as smooth a flow of air as possible into the engine, the Westinghouse 19B was fitted in an inclined position. This resulted in the thrust being directed in a slightly downwards angle, diminishing the already poor performance of the engine. Not to mention, directing the hot exhaust directly onto the wooden decks of an aircraft carrier was not exactly ideal. In the end, only 2 airframes were converted into this configuration, only a single of which ever flew. The performance gain over the BTD-1 was deemed insufficient to merit further testing, and the BTD-2 program was cut short at Douglas's request. While the BTD proved to have superior performance over the earlier XSB2D, it still suffered from poorer performance estimates when compared to the Martin AM Mauler and the Curtiss XBTC, the latter of which I've discussed previously on this channel. This ultimately led Ed Heinemann himself to request that the Navy cancel the BTD project, and to allow Douglas to use the remaining funds to develop an entirely new design, one which was simpler, easier to maintain, and used the combat-proven R-2800. The Navy agreed, however insisted that the new project continue to work with the more powerful R-3350. It was this project that would lead Douglas to develop the XBT-2D, not to be confused with the XSB2D or XTB2D, which eventually evolved into the legendary Skyraider. The Navy's naming convention at the time was clever, albeit a bit convoluted. The XSB2D and BTD both stand as reminders that innovation is rarely a straightforward path. There was a mix of new technologies and changes in doctrine that tried to push the limits of naval aviation for the period. This resulted in a design that looked great on paper, but proved to be too complex to be a reliable workhorse in a wartime environment. Unfortunately for the destroyer, this aircraft was destined to teach the Navy this lesson so that later designs could improve where the destroyer had failed. It was these lessons that directly shaped Ed Heinemann's clean sheet approach for the Skyraider. The destroyer should not be remembered as a failure, rather a lesson guiding the Navy towards a better solution for the next generation of carrier-based strike aircraft. If you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. If you have an interesting topic or aircraft you'd like to see featured on the channel, feel free to leave a comment down below. If you're lucky, you may see your comment turned into a future video. Thanks for watching.